As a criminal psychology expert, I've spent years sifting through the darkest corners of the human mind, but few cases have left me with such a profound sense of chilling anonymity as that of Israel Keyes. He wasn't the type to revel in the spotlight, nor did he leave a trail of chaotic clues. Instead, he operated with a terrifying precision, a ghost in the machinery of everyday life. I remember the first time I delved into his case files, the sheer, calculated detachment of his actions hitting me like a cold wave. It wasn't the brutality that stood out, though it was certainly present, but the absolute lack of emotional residue. Keyes was in essence a predator of opportunity, meticulously planning his crimes months, even years in advance. He would travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles from his home in Alaska to commit murders, often burying kill kits containing weapons cache and disposal tools beforehand. His known victims, at least 3, perhaps many more, were strangers plucked from their lives with a shocking, almost clinical efficiency. He killed them, disposed of their bodies with an unnerving proficiency, and then without a ripple returned to his ordinary life, a seemingly normal father and businessman. The social consequences of his actions were a phantom menace. Victims disappeared without a trace, leaving families grappling with an agonizing uncertainty, a void that could never truly be filled. This chilling pattern, this silent erasure, is what makes his story so unsettling, and it's what compelled me to look back, to try and understand how such a chilling void could be born. How did a child seemingly unremarkable grow into a man who could commit such heinous acts with such profound coldness? To truly understand the chilling adult, we must journey back to his beginnings. Israel Keyes' childhood wasn't marked by overt abuse or dramatic neglect in the conventional sense, at least not outwardly. He grew up in a household steeped in a particular brand of fundamentalist Christianity, one that often emphasized strict adherence to rules and a deep suspicion of the outside world. This created an insulated environment almost hermetically sealed, where external influences were filtered and often condemned. I imagine a young Israel, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, observing the world around him through a heavily tinted window. He wasn't encouraged to question, to explore, or to freely express a wide range of emotions. What he lacked, I believe, was genuine emotional warmth and validation. Not necessarily a lack of love, but perhaps an absence of the kind of nurturing that encourages a child to understand their own feelings and those of others. This early emotional landscape was likely barren, leaving little room for empathy to blossom. Instead, it cultivated a detachment, a quiet self-reliance that bordered on isolation. The world outside his immediate family, with its diverse viewpoints and messy human interactions, was often portrayed as something to be wary of, something potentially corrupting. This early programming, subtle as it may have been, laid the groundwork for a future where connection felt alien and control became paramount. The image of that tinted window stays with me, a barrier not just to the world, but to the very human experience of shared feeling. It was the first shadow, a subtle darkening that would deepen over time. As Israel entered the school system, the subtle disconnect fostered in his early home life began to manifest more overtly. School for many children is a crucible of social development, a place where they learn to navigate complex peer relationships, to give and take, to belong. For Israel, it appears to have been less of a communal space and more of an arena for observation. He wasn't a bullied child in the traditional sense, nor was he an obvious outcast. Instead, he seems to have existed on the periphery, an observer rather than a participant. I imagine him in the classroom, a quiet presence taking in everything but revealing very little. The structured environment of school, with its emphasis on group activities and conformity, likely felt stifling to a mind already accustomed to internalizing. He probably struggled to form genuine connections, not because he was actively rejected, but because he simply didn't know how to bridge the emotional distance. Other children, with their boisterous games and easy laughter, might have seemed like an alien species. Who hurt him? Perhaps no one directly, but rather the cumulative experience of not quite fitting in, of feeling fundamentally different, slowly etched itself onto his young psyche. He was never truly seen, never truly understood, in a way that would foster a sense of belonging. This quiet isolation, this feeling of being an outsider looking in, continued to reinforce that early sense of detachment, further solidifying the walls around his internal world. The turbulent years of puberty, a period of intense self-discovery and often awkward social navigation, likely amplified Israel Keys's internal struggles. While his peers grappled with identity-first crushes and the burgeoning complexities of adolescent social hierarchies, Israel's inner world seems to have begun its quiet, insidious deviation. This wasn't a dramatic rebellion, no outward acting out or overt defiance. Instead, it was a subtle internal shift, a deepening of that inherent detachment. I imagine this as a time when his capacity for empathy, already underdeveloped, began to calcify. The normal emotional responses, the give and take of adolescent friendships and budding romantic interests, were likely alien territory. Instead of forging connections, he probably perfected the art of observation, honing his ability to mimic appropriate social responses without truly feeling them. This is often where we see the first whispers of a developing antisocial personality. Not necessarily through aggression, but through a profound lack of emotional resonance with others. He started to slip away from the normal world, not through a conscious decision, but through a gradual, almost imperceptible internal drift. His thoughts, instead of turning outward to connect, turned inward, creating a self-sufficient, isolated landscape where his own desires and needs became paramount. The tinted window of his childhood, that symbolic barrier, now seemed to become opaque from the inside, reflecting only his own distorted image of reality. This was the quiet unspooling the threads of normalcy, slowly unraveling. As Israel transitioned from adolescence into adulthood, the subtle deviations of his earlier years solidified into a formidable psychological construct, the perfect mask. This wasn't a deliberate theatrical performance, but rather an unconscious adaptation, a chameleon-like ability to blend seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life. He established himself in Alaska, married, had a child, and ran a successful construction business. On the surface, he was the epitome of normalcy, a quiet, hard-working family man respected in his community. I picture him at a PTA meeting or perhaps chatting with neighbors over a fence, his expression calm, his demeanor unassuming. The terrifying truth was that beneath this veneer of ordinary existence lay a profound psychological void. Why didn't anyone notice? Because there was nothing overtly suspicious to notice. His life was meticulously structured, his behaviors predictable and unthreatening. He wasn't prone to outbursts, nor did he exhibit the erratic behavior often associated with disturbed individuals. He had mastered the art of appearing rather than truly being engaged. This ability to compartmentalize, to live a dual life with such chilling proficiency, is a hallmark of certain high-functioning psychopaths. The mask wasn't a burden. It was a tool allowing him to navigate the world without revealing the darkness within. It provided the perfect cover for his increasingly deviant inner landscape, allowing him to prepare for the horrific acts he would eventually commit, all while maintaining the illusion of a completely ordinary existence. The opaque window was now perfectly mirrored on the outside, reflecting back only what society expected to see. While Israel Keys had long been cultivating a deeply detached inner world and perfecting his deceptive outer mask, there often exists a catalyst, a final pressure point that pushes individuals like him from contemplation to action. For Keys, this trigger isn't explicitly documented as a single dramatic event, but rather a culmination of factors that intensified his control fantasies and erased any remaining internal inhibitions. I believe it was less of a sudden shock and more of a gradual erosion of internal barriers, perhaps exacerbated by specific life stressors that for a healthy individual might lead to anxiety or depression, but for Keyes fueled his dark desires. Consider a period where his meticulous planning, his need for ultimate control faced unexpected frustrations in his personal or business life. Perhaps a financial setback, a perceived slight, or even the subtle demands of his family life, which for someone so deeply self-contained could feel like an encroachment. These seemingly minor irritations for a mind already predisposed to an egocentric worldview might have been interpreted as an unbearable loss of control. The final straw wasn't an external shock pushing him over an edge, but rather the internal landscape becoming so barren of empathy and so overgrown with a sense of entitlement that the concept of the other ceased to exist as anything but an object to be manipulated or eliminated. The opaque window, once merely reflective, now became a one-way mirror, allowing him to see out, but preventing any light or feeling from ever reaching within. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a chilling transition to complete psychological self-service. And so the chilling preparations culminated in action. For Israel, Keyes, the act of committing the crime wasn't a frenzy of passion or a desperate cry for attention. Instead, it was an execution of his meticulously laid plans, a moment of profound control. I imagine him in those moments not feeling fear in the conventional sense, but perhaps a heightened sense of alert, a razor-sharp focus on the task at hand. There was no guilt, no remorse, certainly no empathy for his victims. What he felt was likely a perverse sense of power, an absolute dominion over another human life. It was the ultimate expression of his self-contained world, where his desires were the only ones that mattered. This wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about the cold intellectual satisfaction of a job perfectly done, of a plan flawlessly executed. The disposal of the body, the careful cleaning of the scene, the return to his normal life. These were not acts driven by panic, but by a chilling adherence to his own twisted efficiency. He was living out a fantasy of omnipotence where he could erase lives and then, with a simple shift, erase his own involvement. The relief he might have felt wasn't from the act being over, but from the successful affirmation of his control, the validation of his meticulously constructed psychological fortress. The opaque window was now utterly black, from the inside absorbing all light, reflecting nothing, completely isolated from the humanity he was extinguishing. After committing these heinous acts, Israel Keyes did not experience a breakdown. There was no overwhelming guilt, no desperate need to confess, no visible psychological unraveling. Instead, he simply returned to his meticulously crafted normal life. This speaks volumes about the depth of his pathology. For most individuals, the weight of such an action would be crushing, leading to immense psychological distress. But for Keyes, there was a chilling seamlessness. I imagine him going about his day-to-day activities, working, interacting with his family, perhaps even engaging in community events, all while harboring the dark secret of his crimes utterly undisturbed. This isn't recidivism in the sense of a compulsion he couldn't control. It was a continuation of his established pattern of behavior, an almost cyclical process of planning, executing, and then disappearing back into the mundane. The absence of a breakdown highlights the complete absence of empathy. He wasn't haunted by his victims because they were never truly people to him in the first place, merely objects in the fulfillment of his desires. The relief he felt after the crime wasn't a release from inner torment, but the simple satisfaction of a successful operation. He was cold utterly and profoundly cold. The opaque window, now completely dark, continued to serve its purpose, keeping any light of humanity out and his chilling inner world perfectly hidden. There was no internal conflict, only the quiet hum of a predator at peace with its own nature. The meticulously constructed world of Israel Keyes, built on anonymity and chilling control, finally crumbled, not through a dramatic error on his part, but through a confluence of diligent police work, and perhaps in the very end, a touch of his own overconfidence. His arrest wasn't a moment of dramatic confrontation where a hidden monster was finally revealed through a slip of the mask. Instead, it was more like a slow, deliberate peeling away of layers. I recall reviewing the footage of his interrogation. There was no grand confession, no sudden emotional outburst. What was present was a cold, calculating resistance, a continued attempt to manipulate and control the narrative even when cornered. Are they still human? Is there something in their eyes? When I observe individuals like Keyes, I look for any flicker, any hint of the humanity that might have once resided there. With Keyes, it was an almost unsettling blankness. There wasn't remorse, but a detached annoyance at being caught at his carefully constructed world being disrupted. He spoke of his victims with a chilling lack of emotional connection, often referring to them as it. The humanity, if it ever truly existed in the empathetic sense, had long been extinguished. The opaque window remained perhaps even thicker now, reflecting only the dim light of his own self-preservation. In his eyes there wasn't guilt, but a chilling emptiness, a profound absence of the very emotions that define us as human. It was the face of a man who had truly confronted himself and found nothing but a void. The story of Israel Keyes is not just a grim case study, it's a stark warning. As I reflect on his journey from a detached childhood to a meticulous serial killer, the question that echoes most powerfully is, could we have prevented this earlier? The answer, heartbreakingly, is complex. There wasn't a flashing red light, no obvious trauma that screamed for intervention. His decline was silent, internal, a gradual descent into a self-made abyss of control and isolation. The symbolic tinted window, which became opaque, then mirrored and finally utterly black, represents this slow severing of human connection. What this case underscores is the insidious nature of psychological detachment. It highlights the importance of fostering empathy and emotional literacy from a young age, encouraging children to understand and express their feelings, and to connect meaningfully with others. It also speaks to the limitations of our current understanding of such profound deviance. We often look for external triggers, but with Keyes, the most significant shifts were internal, hidden from view. His ability to maintain a perfectly normal facade for so long is a terrifying testament to the potential for darkness to exist alongside apparent normalcy. We must continue to study these cases not to sensationalize, but to learn to understand the subtle cues and patterns that might offer a glimpse into the silent decline before it becomes an irreversible tragedy. The warning is clear. Sometimes the greatest dangers lurk in the quietest corners within the seemingly unremarkable lives.